Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate the answer once again, and I don't wish to continue the line of questioning any longer, but I did want to make sure that I did get it on the record that I believe that something transpired in this state with regard to our elections in both the primary and general election of 2020 that should not have happened. And I believe that it's never been thoroughly debated, investigated, or followed up on in a way that is satisfactory to me. Someone who knows our election law intimately and knows just exactly how it was abused in that case. I am fearful, Madam President, not about the policy of no excuse absentee voting, but just how a broadly written constitutional amendment might be abused, and that is why I'm standing here today. This might be a good point to reiterate something that I said during the previous debate on early voting, which is a desire to admonish the press and also any of my colleagues who would like to mischaracterize anyone's position for or against this bill, because this debate is not at all about whether or not someone is in favor of expanding access to voting. Every person is in favor of access and increasing that access to voting, including me. And any suggestion about Republicans wishing to suppress the vote or somehow standing in the way of progress is misplaced, it is wrong, and in fact, I would say it is just beyond the pale, because I am here in good faith, Madam President, for the purpose of trying to develop a good public policy on this subject with my colleagues any way possible. If there is, in fact, a problem with access in our elections, I would say that the number one problem is the lengthy lines that exist in our major cities on election day. It's something that I brought up repeatedly in committee and have offered attempts to resolve. And that is something that we don't seem to address. So while there are many, many comments made by folks about increasing access, there are also failures in our current system that I think would be much more easily corrected. And that's where I would start. Just to clarify the policy change that exists in the document itself of the resolution before us, it's very simple. We are essentially removing a section that says that those folks who are qualified voters who are unable to appear at the polling place on the day of election, which I presume would be the days of election, assuming early voting does go forward at the request of our voters, because of absence from the city or town which they are inhabitants of, or because of sickness or physical disability, or because the tenets of the religion forbid secular activity. So essentially, it covers quite a bit of ground. It covers people that are working, it covers people that are out of town, it covers people that are disabled, it covers people that are sick, it covers people in the military. I would suggest that the vast majority of situations that would preclude someone from being able to vote in person on election day are covered by our current no excuse absentee voting policy, which I will add lasts for 45 days. And I would point out, even though this body saw to it to pass a constitutional amendment for early voting, which we do not know the length of time that might end up being, 45 days of early voting is essentially what our current absentee ballot policy creates. This proposal eliminates that and replaces it simply with people who, quote, in the bill, will not appear on the day of election. It was mentioned early on that there are some people that believe election day is one day, and that people should appear in person because it's that important. There are many people that I represent that believe that, and in fact, that's my immediate response as a relatively young and fit person. But I am well aware that there are people that have other difficulties that might preclude them from being able to have access. Although I think that over time, this legislature and the good citizens of the state have saw fit to put together a constitution that covers those concerns in a fairly detailed way. What's happening here today, Madam President, is a massive expansion of that situation. It is not simply adding another excuse or coming up with a reason that we had not contemplated before, but rather replacing the idea that the way we should vote is on election day in person with an election that could last for a significant length of time, at least 45 days, given this resolution before us. There would be early voting, not in person, but by mail for 45 days if this passes. That's not a small change. And I just think that people should be able to view it in the clearest light possible. And all of this boils down to one very, very important point, which is that in-person voting will always be more secure than by mail voting. I started this conversation by suggesting that our paramount responsibility to our constituents is to preserve the integrity of the election and the faith that the voters have that the election that they are participating in is legitimate and that the results can be trusted. If you turn on the various national news networks, you will get varying opinions about what has happened in the last several presidential elections. In 2016, Democrats nationally claimed that the election was not legitimate because of interference from outside sources helping then President Trump become elected. In 2020, President Trump claimed that elections across this country were illegitimate because of unsolicited mailing of ballots, failure to properly identify voters, unscrupulous voting machines, and various other things. As I have pointed out time and time again, Madam President, I don't know the details about any of those things. I can only speak to what I know about, which is the election law and the circumstances in our state. But what I do know about those two claims and those situations that continue to permeate the discussion and the discourse of politics in our country, which is hopelessly divided, is that we should be working here every day to get rid of any doubt that either party or any person in this country has about whether our elections have integrity. All election laws should pass unanimously. That's what I believe, Madam President. Every time we pass a law regarding election policy, it ought to pass unanimously. I don't believe that about anything else. We pass a lot of laws through this chamber and through the House of Representatives, and many of them pass unanimously and many of them do not. But election laws are the rules of the game by which we are all here debating the other bills that become law. And that's something everyone should agree on. When you sit down with your family and friends to play cards, don't you establish the rules of the game together? Yes, you do. And you do that because you want everyone to be on the same page about what those rules are. So, Madam President, I just want to draw attention to the fact that this bill today is not going to pass unanimously. And that should raise a red flag for everyone here and everyone watching. That means that someone doesn't agree with these rules of the game. And when you're talking about what is so important, which is the process by which our constituents, the citizens of this state, make their determinations about who they want to represent them, it should be absolutely beyond any doubt that the right person was chosen and elected and they received the proper number of votes. I've said repeatedly today and throughout the entire process by which brought us here to debate this proposed constitutional amendment, that I would gladly support a constitutional amendment to expand absentee voting, to in fact even pass no excuse absentee voting, provided, of course, there were safeguards in place. And I'm going to get into what those safeguards are in a moment. But I want to make it very clear that the process for changing our Constitution, for anyone listening, is very simple. A constitutional amendment must be brought before both chambers of the General Assembly, the House and the Senate. If that proposal passes by 75% in both chambers, it will then go on the ballot for voters to have their say, and if it passes, the constitutional amendment will become effective. If a proposal is presented to either or both chambers and does not reach the required 75% threshold, but does reach a 50% or more threshold, then it must be carried over to a new legislature, not just the next year necessarily, but after the next election. Because we all serve two-year terms, that means that if it happens in the first year of a biennium, that means that you'd have to wait 2 years to get to the first year of the next biennium where there's new legislators seated. Otherwise, you could do it in the second year and then the first year. As it stands today, Madam President, this proposal passed the House of Representatives already, but it did not reach the required 75%. So what happens in this chamber today really doesn't mean a lot unless the amendment fails entirely, in which case the process would have to begin again. But assuming it passes by any margin over 50% all the way to 100%, the 2 years will still have to go by because the 75% was not met in the House of Representatives. There is one exception to that was not mentioned by my colleague when she opened her remarks, and that is we have the power, Madam President, in this chamber to modify this proposal. We can change this constitutional amendment right here in this chamber, and if it were to pass by a 75% majority, it would go back to the House of Representatives to be voted on again. And if it reached that 75%, this constitutional amendment could happen immediately. I want to make it clear, Madam President, that I have worked very, very hard to try and find a way for us to find common ground in a bipartisan fashion that will get us to 75% this year. And I'm going to offer several amendments, which any one of might be cause to increase that threshold to a point where we are that much more likely to get to that goal. But if none of the amendments are adopted, Madam President, it does not matter what happens in this chamber. And even if every person voted for this, we would still have to wait 2 years. So I'm saying all this because I want to make it completely, utterly clear to the majority party that if they want to see no excuse absentee voting, they can see it happen this time. But they need to work with the minority to change this bill in a way that's acceptable to us and ultimately the House of Representatives when the bill goes back before them. But it is entirely 100% possible, Madam President, and I would encourage them to think very hard about the amendments that I offer in that light. And the amendments that I'm going to offer are all focused on maintaining voter integrity, which I said is the other piece of the puzzle. People in this chamber are apt to walk around and say, one person, one vote is so important. And in fact, when we had the debate on the national popular vote, that was the rallying cry, despite the fact that the national popular vote is in fact the exact opposite of that, since it encourages us to give away our votes to voters as a result of things that happen outside of our state. But I believe that one person, one vote is the standard we should be operating by, and that means that every person should have their right protected and their vote counted. But anything that happens that undermines the sanctity of that vote, someone having their vote disenfranchised, someone failing to have their vote counted, someone voting who's not supposed to be, or voting multiple times or in multiple locations. All of those things go to undermine the concept of one person and one vote, which is why I stand before you encouraging not just the expansion of access to voting, but the protection of integrity of voting. And don't take it from me, Madam President. The President of the Senate, Martin Looney himself, said in a debate on early voting just a couple of years ago, quote unquote, the subject of absentee balloting, he was referring to when he said, is legitimately controversial because in reality, we never really know for sure who is casting an absentee ballot. I will also remind this chamber that a Democratic colleague of mine got up during that debate on absentee voting and described his own personal experience with absentee vote fraud occurring in the city of Bridgeport. There are members of this body who have been in numerous newspaper articles concerned about the legitimacy of absentee ballot voting in their own elections and other elections in their city. It is not something that is unknown to the people in this room. I'm going to take a moment just to go through a few examples to point out that the discussion of voter fraud may not be as expansive as some people who follow President Trump might claim, but it is also not non-existent either. It is a real thing that needs to be taken into consideration when we're here making public policy. This is from an article that appeared in the Waterbury Republican American in October of 2020. 2018, Stafford. Troy Stevenson was convicted of making a false statement on an absentee ballot, as well as second-degree forgery. He committed the crime in connection with the mayoral election in Stafford. Betty Chappell was convicted of making a false statement on an absentee ballot, as well as second-degree forgery, again on a mayoral election in Stafford. I want to just point out that as I read these, almost none of these folks face any significant penalty. Some were fined, but I don't know that anyone served any jail time. And that's something that might be viewed favorably or unfavorably by those concerned about protecting the integrity of our elections. 2013, Hartford. The State Elections Enforcement Commission ruled that State Representative Minnie Gonzalez was knowingly present while 4 voters fraudulently filled out absentee ballots at City Hall during the 2006 election, and she was fined $4,500. 2011, Bridgeport. Councilwoman Lydia Martinez admitted to illegally assisting in the filling out of absentee ballots. I'm not making these things up, Madam President. These were in one newspaper article, and I've only scratched the surface of what is here. She was ordered by the Connecticut Elections Enforcement Commission to pay a $500 fine. Not the first time she was fined by the commission. 2009, Stafford. Lillian Cummings Stevenson agreed to a consent order after the SEEC found her guilty of illegally signing and submitting 2 absentee ballot request forms on behalf of her sons who were living in Europe. She was fined a whopping $200. 2005, Hartford. Again, all from the same article, and I could have pulled out several other articles also. Prenzina Holloway voted using another voter's absentee ballot in the 2004 Democratic primary, ordered to pay a civil penalty of $2,000. 2003, Hartford. Former State Representative Barnaby Horton was charged with absentee ballot fraud after he was caught inducing elderly residents to cast absentee ballots for him. After a lengthy court battle, he pleaded guilty to felony charges of ballot fraud, and so on. 2001, Bridgeport. Sybil Allen, while serving as a Democrat on the Bridgeport Town Committee, engaged in a range of absentee ballot-related fraud. Allen completed ballot applications in the name of residents, forged signatures, and on at least one occasion got a voter to forge a ballot registration form for a family member who no longer lived in the community. Warren Blunt, a city councilman, pleaded guilty to being present while people cast their absentee ballots and subsequently taking those ballots while running for re-election in the town's Democratic primary. Paulette Park, while working for a candidate in the Bridgeport's 2000 Democrat Town Committee primary election, illegally persuaded voters to list false reasons for requesting absentee ballots. (2001), Bridgeport. As part of the Get Out the Vote campaign leading up to the 2000 election, Ronald Cavanis admitted to distributing absentee ballots, being present while people filled them out, and then collecting them. After an investigation, he agreed to resign from the Democratic Town Committee, not seek re-election for 2 years, and pay a fine of $4,000, which was eventually reduced to $1,000. Just a few examples to point out to folks that no one here is claiming that elections were stolen, that there's massive voter fraud. No one's claiming that at all. I'm simply pointing out that it is a reality. And it is a substantial reality in the sense that when there is any type of irregularity that has to do with elections or anything that might fit into the category of voter fraud, it is almost certainly having to do with absentee balloting. Because as Senator Looney said, you never really know who's filling out something that is sent in the mail. A big difference from someone appearing in person at the polls. Just following up in that vein, there's an organization in this state called Fight Voter Fraud, and they have been investigating the 2020 election. And they're just a couple of folks. They don't have a big base of support or, employees working for them. You've got just a couple of folks who are going through the data from our November election, and they've uncovered numerous irregularities. March 16, 2021, they put out a press release indicating that the Fight Voter Fraud analytics team, and I think that's funny because I happen to know Dominic and Linda. I think that's their analytics team, has discovered 103 Connecticut citizens of the same or similar name, birth date, and address that voting records show as having voted twice. Printed and electronic versions of the data were delivered directly to the Secretary of State's office. I do not believe they've even got a response to this inquiry as of yet. April 13th, 2021, they also issued another press release. And this one really took me by surprise, especially since some of the policy that we've passed in this chamber this year relates directly to these concerns. New research indicates 56 inmates serving felony sentences voted in 2020. State records appear to indicate that 56 incarcerated felons voted in the 2020 election. And just reading down, I highlighted a section which woke me up. I was falling asleep. I was tired when I was reading this, and this brought me to light faster than a high caffeine cup of coffee. It says, inexplicably, inmates can register to vote and apply for an absentee ballot, which are sent to prison addresses as evidenced in the state voter files, often with the 6-digit inmate number as part of the address. Madam President, if we do not have the ability to determine that someone who is completely ineligible to vote because they are in fact serving a felony sentence and are actually inside the prison asking for an absentee ballot to be mailed to them there, then how can we tell the voters of this state that we have the ability to expand absentee balloting exponentially? And when I say exponentially, that's what I mean, Madam President. Prior to the most recent election in the state, a fraction of voters, a tiny percentage, a couple, 2-3%, is all that ever requested an absentee ballot under the parameters that were afforded under our Constitution and statutory requirements. But in the most recent election in 2020, that number skyrocketed. And so did the cost to taxpayers, which is another concern that I have and will address in a moment. It's not just fraud either. People are often disenfranchised in the process of absentee ballots, something that concerns me greatly. During a previous debate, I discussed my concern over the drop boxes that were installed across our state, mostly outside of town halls, but in some other locations too, because those drop boxes are not monitored as thoroughly as I believe something that contains the ballots for an election should be. And in fact, sometimes those drop boxes are ignored over an entire weekend, and there are no cameras on them, and I've described them before as an attractive nuisance to someone who wanted to disrupt an election. And I am very thankful, Madam President, that we did not have this problem in the previous election, but I am fearful it could happen. But one of the things that was interesting is that I had a photo sent to me by someone showing one of these absentee ballot drop boxes overflowing with ballots. And I didn't know what to make of it, so I passed this information on to the State Election Enforcement Commission, who investigated and were very pleased to explain to me that that was a result of people who had voted after Election Day and their votes were not counted. Now, that might have satisfied some people who were single-minded in their focus to discredit any argument I might make about the potential for fraud. But I don't believe it even occurred to them that those people thought they were voting in that election and that their votes counted, but they did not. That concerns me, Madam President. I want people's votes to count. There's also the concern over whether someone might be able to change their mind. This constitutional amendment does not spell this out, but based on the previous policy that we used in the most recent election, the time frame that someone was allowed to reverse their ballot and choose a different candidate was changed from the day of the election at 10 a.m. as a deadline to the Thursday before Election Day, which I believe is a significant change and one that might disenfranchise someone who comes up with a different determination on what they want to do as far as the election as things get closer to the end. I think people are understanding my point here, Madam President, which is that this is not as simple as it seems. It's not just changing the policy from getting rid of the limited number of excuses, which I don't consider limited because I think they cover just about everything that you can think of, to no excuse whatsoever. There's a lot of other concerns. And there are other things that I will mention briefly, but are worthy of entire debates and discussions on their own. Like, do we properly audit absentee ballots? No, we don't. I mentioned the security of drop boxes, but there's far more to it than that. Our entire process relies on someone filling out a document, signing the outside of a ballot envelope, and returning it to be counted, which works great in states that actually have the person's signature on file. But in Connecticut, though some towns do have some signatures on file, there is no approved process to verify those signatures at all in Connecticut. None whatsoever. And in fact, the town poll workers across our state were told during the last election that as long as there is a mark on the outside of that ballot, it doesn't matter if it matches a signature, whether that signature is on file or not. It doesn't matter whether the name matches. It doesn't matter whether it's an X or a line or a dot or a stray mark. That ballot is to be counted. There's also concerns about the chain of custody when you expand absentee ballots substantially, where they will be stored, when they will be counted, and so on. These are all things that I believe, Madam President, should be developed in conjunction with opening the door to no excuse absentee balloting. So as a result,